Three. Hey, this is Will Spur with Abysmal Hymns, and today's guest is Shoshana Edelberg. She's a doctoral student at West Georgia College, and she's doing her dissertation on the intersection of demons with psychology. So, first off, I want to know what prompted this to kind of be the focus of your study.
Yeah, I guess it's an unusual focus. But I've always been interested, as you know, in unusual things. I've always been interested in esoteric and arcane and occult things in the true sense of the word occult, which means hidden. Um, though it has other connotations now, obviously. And my curiosity about those things has led me to all sorts of interesting places. All the world's major religions, most of its minor ones, paths that you couldn't call religions. But 7 years ago, it led me to Candler School of Theology at Emory. And there were three classes I took there that put demons on my radar. And I can briefly tell you what that it was, what those were, if you'd like. So the first was a class in the monastic theology, sorry, and we were studying in that class the desert monks of the fourth century. And I came upon a work called the Practicos. I don't know how well you can see it, but that's it, by a monk called Evagrius Ponticus, and it has a demonology in it. And it has a demonology in it because the monks were engaged with battles against demons in the desert. So they came up with descriptions of these demons in the demonology, and he's not the only one, but he was the one I first came across. And they came up with methods of engaging with these demons as well. And as I was reading it over, I noticed that the descriptions of what the demons did read like symptoms of mental illness. It read like the DSM-5, which is the diagnosis Bible of psychology and psychiatry. So I kind of tucked that back in my head, and that's interesting. And then later, I was writing a paper on magic use, kind of in and around the first century. And I came upon something I'm familiar with, but I hadn't read for a while, which is the Testament of Solomon, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And most people who are interested in what now gets called the Goetia or Goetic demons are familiar with this source. It's probably the earliest formal demonology that we have, though it's slippery to date and it mixes genres. But again, reading through it, I noticed the conjunction between what these demons could do, what they were known for doing, and descriptions of mental illness symptoms. And then that got really interesting to me. And I thought, I wonder if some of the weaponry that the ancient world had against demonic encounters to use against demonic encounters, not just possession, because possession's rare, but any kind of vexation or torment from these creatures. Then the final one was a seminar I took on the psychologist William James, early psychologist, and he wrote a lot about religious experience and mystical experience, one of the first really open-minded folks in psychology. And that kind of gave me my first framework for, well, the ancient world viewed mental illness as being caused by demons. Would it be useful to reclaim that in some way and use some of the ancient techniques to help people that are experiencing what I would call spiritual emergencies, sort of crises of self-transformation. So Emory was not interested in that work, but the University of West Georgia was, fortunately, and it's a great department. So that's where I am now, sort of teaching and writing and trying to finish this work.
Awesome. So, and I'll kind of touch back on one thing you brought up, then we'll kind of move forward with getting to demons. But with the desert monks, did their theology and kind of practice, was that at all related to the time that Jesus spent in the wilderness when he was tempted by Satan?
Yes, I think you could say that. And I think that's a really good observation. And so the short answer to that would be yes.
Okay.
That was definitely kept in mind as the demons did these battles. And the demons, though, they're personified as thoughts, deadly thoughts, which then become the deadly sins that we're now all familiar with, which is a philosophical demotion as far as I'm concerned, but that's a whole nother topic. But yes, that's a good observation. Yes.
Gotcha. Well, and in reading what you wrote, I noticed there's a couple things that I think are important to touch on, kind of before we get really into the nitty-gritty of it. One being the differentiation between demons and the devil or Satan. I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that they're definitely two separate concepts. Where one, like Satan is the adversarial force, which is of a higher ranking, I guess, where demons, particularly in this sense, could be, lower energy forms. And also that plays into the next thing, which is, are they real? Well, I mean, I totally go into everything with everything is real until you prove it not to be. Um, but I mean, then like you brought up, then it gets into you can get mired into deciding, well, what is real? Because I know later on, and a lot of your work is follows Novus Liber by Carl Jung, where a lot of
Correct.
that was his psychic reality that he was experiencing when he went into maybe it was a depression, but the period of time after he left working with Freud. Um, so
Yeah,
that was
absolutely.
definitely real for him. And yeah, and I also think, and we can talk on this for a minute, that it's interesting with, Jung, he split off from Freud because, he discovered what he found to be or thought of as the soul, which Freud like was against. And then you brought up William James, whose book Varieties of Religious Experience was like a huge influence on Bill Wilson, who founded AA, and also Carl
Yes.
Jung was a consultant with Bill Wilson, which I
Yeah.
think is interesting because then you get into, well, AA is one of the few methods of treatment that is court mandated. So then even the lines
Because it
of like,
works.
yeah, because it works. And so there's separation of like church and state gets cloudy there, but I think it also kind of lends credence, maybe even scientific credence to um, these theories, whether you call it demons or whatever, but the method of using spirituality as a cure for a mental illness, but if it's court mandated, then that has some weight behind it. And all treatment centers tend to use that as a groundwork. Is that kind of explored in your study?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in what you just said, so I'm gonna kind of go from the beginning to where you just ended up, if
Okay.
that's okay. And I'll
Yeah.
try to do it as briefly and in as interesting a way as I can. So you brought up the issue of are they real? Okay, and you also kind of touched on how I would answer that question. Because as far as I'm concerned, demons are real for people that have encounters with demons. Those experiences are very real. And so, yeah, you do have to then get into, well, what's the nature of reality? And in my work, we are talking about something called the imaginal realm. And that comes from scholar Henry Corbin, but was taken by Jung and by his pupil James Hillman, and sort of by a lot of others that walk in their footsteps. And the imaginal realm would be considered sort of a in-between space, a space in between physical or material reality and some divine realm that we can't access. So it's almost like the veil, as some people would describe it, but you can pierce that veil in visionary states, shamanic states, if you will, dreaming, and the exercises that you mentioned that Jung was doing in Liber Novus. So Corbin and Hillman in particular would say that's a real place. Now, a place, and here we get sort of into it, but a place is different than a location. A location is a physical reality that has an address or, is located in a place that you can know where it is and go to. Place, realm, world are different, and like these others would claim that they are real. And that is where you encounter demons, I believe, to some extent. There's other ways to encounter things like that, but you can encounter them in the imaginal. And in that sense, if you believe the imaginal real is real, you can believe the demon is real. So that's my answer to that question, though it may not satisfy people that are like, but is it here, right now in my living room, physically?
I mean, I would say too to that, if you have a demon that makes you do a lot of shopping, it is delivering things to your physical address. So,
Indeed, and I think demons can do that and all sorts of other plaguing things, which is why it's a good idea to be able to kind of work through why it's making you do that, which is the whole therapeutic approach, is to be able to interrogate it, and name it and, get some ability to sort of work through that. And that brings us to Satan, devil, demon. And that's all very slippery. You could talk forever about just the changing language and the changing conceptualizations from the Greek daimon to the Latin daimon to then demon as in scripture and demon as in, say, the Catholic Catechism or whatever. It's very ambiguous. And that's my big contention about demons is that they are by nature very ambiguous and very slippery. And that persists, like even now in places that you think might be rigid, like the Catholic Church, it's not. There's a lot of slipperiness. And the fallen angel explanation of demons is late and also sort of evolves. So they're slippery. What's interesting is that the Greek daimon has commonalities with Satan in the idea that it's an adversary and maybe a harsh teacher. When you do battle, you learn something about yourself, you exercise your spiritual muscles, and you see that like in the book of Job. For example, where this adversary has God's permission to torment this man. Anyway, that's off on a tangent. But the original Diamond had that sense too. And that's what you see in Jung to kind of take it back to there. He's encountering diamonds, demons. He uses all those different words because the language is slippery. But it's the same as the desert monks, which is a tradition Jung well knew, by the way, and writes about, fairly extensively. So it's this same idea of I'm growing by doing battle with this harsh but perhaps necessary adversary or teacher, if that makes sense.
right, yeah, totally. And it's interesting you brought up, the shamanic part of it because I've been getting really into kind of studying on, now you have scientists that are involved in psychedelic research and they're
Oh,
starting to
absolutely.
look at why are all these people seeing the same entities when they're taking DMT? Why are all these kids
Absolutely.
seeing the Hat Man when they're taking Benadryl? Um,
Yep.
So is that like the commonalities of psychosis, I think could be, where the demon comes into play. And, I think that, and you brought up in your work about, I think Hollywood has kind of jaded us on, what a demon is supposed to look like. It's not necessarily, you know, Reagan throwing up pea soup. You could be talking about
No.
energy, and even I think even in possession cases, it doesn't look like Hollywood. Nobody's levitate. Maybe they are. I don't know.
No.
But yeah, and so then that also made me think about, because you brought in the Book of Job. My favorite demon story from the Bible is the one in the fifth chapter of Mark, because that guy is, whenever I read that, and I used to read it all the time when I was like a little kid, I was obsessed with that story. Because the guy is like shouting and running to Jesus before he's even off the boat. And I always pictured in my head like Ozzy when he runs off stage being like, ah, then we're gonna go crazy tonight. So yeah, that is, and it gets in, you were talking about pastoral care. So I
Hmm.
guess that's where like exorcisms come in at the extreme end, like that guy who was, obviously that story had some weight to it because it had carried around long enough to get to Mark, and that guy was well known before there was no internet. They weren't taking TikToks of this guy cutting himself in the graveyard, so word of mouth had carried it. So that seems like a historical uh depiction. Definitely, I don't know if it qualifies as an account if it's in the Bible, but then they would have to say, I guess a historian would have to say, well, what is the chain of witnesses that this went through to qualify that as a legitimate account? And so how
Right.
does
And
that
that's a
factor
whole,
in?
that part is a whole can of worms. But to backtrack a second to some of the things that you said, because they're all really germane to my work and really important, the literature on DMT that you brought up and entity encounters is really, really powerful. It's almost like, certain entities are associated with certain psychedelics and certain other kinds of drugs. Is that because we naturally produce DMT in our brains? We don't know where or how exactly. Some have pointed to the pituitary gland, which is, of course, associated with all kinds of other spiritual experience. And so that's really interesting and gives fuel to the idea that these encounters can be beneficial, even if the entity seems quote unquote evil, which I think is a heavy word. I do think that scriptural accounts of demons are important when you're talking about demons in the Western tradition, which I am. I would like to do cross-cultural work on them later and sort of see if things like Japanese fox demons or Islamic jinn sort of work in the same way, carry the same ambiguity, carry the same adversarial context, but one thing at a time. And right now, I'm definitely only in sort of the Judeo-Christian framework in looking at demons, and there's plenty there. This is not theological work, it's psychological work. So I'm not drawing from scriptural depictions very much in my personal work right now, but Jung did, and Hillman did, and others did. So that piece is definitely there, but it's rooted in a psychological framework, my work. And the utility of demons as sort of a psychological image that, I might ask you, and please don't try this at home, people. This is experimental stuff, and you need to do this kind of work in a safe space. But what if I asked you to personify your depression as a demon, to name it, to tell me what it looked like, to draw it. What if we worked together to create an amulet that could banish it? That's the sort of thing that I'm looking at. And so, sure, there's a theological piece and there's a parapsychological piece, but it's very much rooted in sort of analytical settings, or as you mentioned, pastoral care settings where people are open to the idea of, okay, it's a demon, but also have to be stabilized enough so that they're not traumatized in any way by the idea of demon, though there's a huge association between demons and trauma out there, and it's been used in dream work in particular for people who have experienced trauma.
Right, totally. And I think that too, it's interesting because, thinking about DMT, the one time that I did DMT, I saw, I like blasted off and went to this like crystal city full of aliens that were waving at me. Like I'd already been there before and they were like, "Oh yeah, you're back. Good to see you again." Um, so that kind of made me think too of when we're talking about fallen angels. And as I was reading your work and I was thinking about that, we kind of get into the how our conceptions of things have shifted over time. And sometimes I think about the term fallen angels and perhaps what would the chances be that that was actually, in fact, it referenced in the Bible where they said that they saw him fall from heaven like a star. Well, could be aliens. Um, so, you know,
Absolutely.
and I think that aliens are obviously another psychological construct too, whether, my belief is they're not from
Absolutely.
space, but from interdimension, and that by funding space programs, we're really gaslighting ourselves and distracting ourselves from that should be invested in quantum physics, but I think that that's also
Oh, that's
spiritual.
important.
Yeah, that it's also
Yeah.
spiritual because spiritual is about vibrational frequencies. And you bring
Yeah,
up
I would tend
music,
to agree with you completely.
you
Yeah.
you, you bring up music, and I think that music is magical because it's using manipulating vibrational frequencies to elicit physical response. Um, and music therapy has been a thing too, and I think that a lot of people, with like heavy metal, find that very therapeutic and cathartic. Um, so do you think that that archetype of demons, why is it so closely associated with things that are creating those vibrational frequencies?
Yeah, so again, you touch on like a million layered things. Um, first of all, I tend to agree with you in your assessment of what an alien is. And again, like all these constructs we are defining, and who knows if they define themselves that way, things tend to spill over their boundaries and don't want to be put in boxes because it's convenient for us. And that is certainly the case with demons or uh, creatures, cryptids you find in bestiaries, which also show up in psychedelic trips. So, yeah, all of the above. And you kind of briefly mentioned quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and skidded over it. But I want to stop and point out that there's a lot in quantum mechanics that helps bolster transpersonal psychology and parapsychology. Now, I'm not a physicist, so I'm not going to get into that, but there's a lot to that, especially in terms of something like the imaginal, which might be a place and not a place at the same time, or might be layered places at the same time. So I think all of that is really, really critical, and it definitely bolsters people who are trying to make the case for this kind of psychology, which, by the way, is not mainstream psychology any sense. Psychology is still very materialistic overall. My university is not, so I'm very fortunate to be able to do this work and get support for it. So, did I miss anything that you asked
No, no, no. I think
me?
that hit a lot. I mean, too, that's with psychology and psychiatric treatment, it tends to be you get funding if it can lead to a drug that we can create to make money from, where just like,
Oh, no doubt.
medicine isn't going to prescribe you joining a gym because that's not an easy fix. That's like a commitment. Um, but it did make me think, we're talking about vibrational frequencies, how, you know, electro ECT was used, and that electricity was A, causing a vibrational shift, and B, causing trauma, which, sometimes left the people in a catatonic state afterwards. Um, so how, and then we had things like, what was it, trepanning, where they would, leave holes in the head, cut holes in the head in medieval times to let demons out, which maybe that was relieving fluid buildup and pressure from infections, who knows? But how much into like some of the more medieval treatment methods do you get in your studies?
Pretty deeply, because you pointed to a lot of things about sort of the for-profit nature of mental health care and what impact that might have. I think that we pathologize people and experiences so that they can get a diagnosis out of the DSM so that insurance companies will pay for drugs and other things. And this isn't to say that drugs are never helpful. I'm not going to say that, but I am going to say that we are pathologizing things that are within the realm of human experience and have been within the realm of human experience since the ancient world. And so, yeah, all of that is a very critical piece of it, because who's going to pay for demon therapy, right? It's not like something that's necessarily available because of the for-profit piece and the drug company piece and the DSM-5 piece and just the cultural need to sort of pathologize that which is not normal. Of course, first you have to define normal as well as you have to define real, and that's slippery, but think of how many visionaries and artists and geniuses and people are pathologized and either, put on drugs or locked in places. So to answer your question, I'm very steeped in ancient world and medieval sorts of therapies and technologies, although, I'm not going to advocate trepanning like as part of my own therapeutic practice. But it's fascinating. I mean, that's a lot in Egypt, in particular in ancient Egypt, and you see the skulls growing back. So people survived that, for years and years and years, and then went on with their lives. And I want to make the point, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but it was the last question you asked. We constantly find that ancient and medieval techniques worked and were good. For example, people now are using leeches in the modern context of medicine because they close wounds really, really well, like a lot better than stitches in some cases. And so it used to be, oh, how barbaric leeches, but no, leeches are effective. There are surgeons that use obsidian blades rather than steel blades because obsidian is sharper and more precise. So, I don't think we should throw things out because they seem strange to us, because we can go back and reclaim these things and find that they were efficacious because ancient and medieval people were not stupid. And I think we think because we have the internet or whatever that we're intellectually superior, and we are not.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm very
Inferior. We
interested
don't
in
read
re
as much now. We just Google
exactly,
everything. We
nor do
don't
we
have
talk.
context because we're not reading books.
Totally. And we don't talk as much and we
Mhm.
don't have the curiosity. And they were better educated in some ways. I mean, it was a more elite education, so it's not available to the masses, but they could speak five or six languages um,
We
if you
can't
were
even speak our
educated.
own.
Exactly. So, no, I am very interested, and the techniques that I'm particularly interested in are the creation of amulets, are the use of barbarous names, are exorcism rituals, but again, not the kind that you see in movies. Every culture has had exorcism rituals, and they don't look like that. Um,
Yeah, the movie ones always look like some kind of pedophile BDSM because you always have the young girl tied up to the bed as two older men uh stand over her. Which
yep, you are so right. I've noticed that too. I was just talking about that with my fiance the other night. They're very sexualized,
yeah.
those movies, which is
So
gross.
before we close out, let's talk about kind of the future, the other side of science that you're also working on a project involving in like psychic research. Is that?
Yes. So my one of the professors I work with, who's also on my dissertation committee, is a parapsychologist. She's awesome. She has an expertise in ghosts, among other things, and so she fields similar questions about the nature of reality all the time. Study at the University of West Georgia on precognition, specifically whether a certain state, which is an meditative sort of sensory altered state, facilitates precognition. And we're looking at believers, people who come in already predisposed to these sorts of psi or anomalous experiences, and people that are completely skeptical to see does the state is it like a placebo effect that only works for people who are sort of predisposed to those experiences, or is it legitimately facilitating the experience of precognition? So it's a really cool study. Anybody that's interested, if you have any people that are around Atlanta to West Georgia or Eastern Alabama, they can look it up on Facebook because
I'm gonna put a link
that
to in
post.
the
Okay,
description.
great. Even better, just go to the link in the
Go to the link.
description. Go to link. And it's a public post, so not a big deal. But yeah, there's a QR code on it, and you just kind of go through the QR code to the screening questionnaire. And if you're a believer or a skeptic, we'd be interested in bringing you to the lab and seeing if you have precog capabilities. If you were closer, I'd say you'd be a really good candidate for
Yeah, I'm
this, but it'd be a
down in
long drive.
Florida now. Well, cool. Well, in
Yep,
closing, I
yep, yep.
guess we'll
So,
definitely have you back and talk some more about both your further work on demons and this study. But I guess we still got a few minutes left, so the last question is going to be: so in preparation for this and delving into media, how many of these demon or exorcism movies did you have you watched to either get some comic relief or to kind of get into the archetype?
um, so I want to first say I call demons images, not archetypes, just because of the formality of different kinds of psychology. And so I prefer to think of them as is made of images. So anyway, not a big deal, just my particular work, and it's arguable. Other people might call them archetypes. Oh, so I just went off on that tangent and forgot the rest of what you asked me.
So, what kind of demon movies or media did you ingest
Oh,
outside of
demon
studies?
movie.
Yeah.
So I don't like the movies very much because it's the same old tropes and the same old jump scares. And you can just see it coming a mile away. Now, I have read some of the demon books, And I mention in my introduction to my dissertation, which you read, about paranormal romances with demons as the sexy main characters who are redeemed by the love of the heroine. And I find those utterly hysterical and, have read a bunch of them. There's even one, these aren't demons, but that personify the four horsemen of the apocalypse as like sexy heroes. That I, yes,
Was it like a
seriously.
Laurel K. Hamilton where she dated all four of them? Was that like part of her harem?
Similar, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they're usually very, as my friend would say, saucy. They're very saucy.
Baba
And
strippers.
the evil turns good because of the heroine. So I have read a ton of those. And I've of
Plays into
course listened to a
the
lot of
good
music,
delusion of I can
and
fix
always
him.
have. Yeah, exactly.
I can
Even if
fix him.
he's deaf,
He's a
he's
werewolf, no
literally deaf.
problem.
Yeah, exactly. He's a demon, it's cool.
Right.
So yeah, that's all funny stuff. The movies, I've watched the usual amount of them, but they're very rarely creative or interesting. So, um, you know.
I mean, I always watch The Exorcist twice a year. That's such a classic. Even though it's
Well,
the progenitor of all
yeah,
those stereotypes.
exactly. So like once you've watched it, you don't really need many of the others because they're all just going to follow the exact same
It's all cover
pattern.
bands, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, I only bring that up in my work because it shows that demons still have such a grip on our imaginations, even in a very secular culture.
Right. And there's something to it. I'll kind of close with this. I went to a Bigfoot convention where this one of the speakers had worked with Jane Goodall. And she was
Ah,
going on a Bigfoot show and she was asking Jane Goodall, should she do it? Because the scientific community was going to blackball her. And Jane Goodall was like, well, tell him to fuck off. She was like, in my travels, I would always ask hunters who would go miles and miles and come back to these villages, and that was their main source of communication, was telling these stories, if they had ever seen a ape that walked on 2 feet. And she said once some hunters came back and said yes they did, and it was 7 feet tall. So she said there's something to it, because the Bigfoot story has lasted over all these cultures, have their own story of it, which can be said with demons as well. Like you brought up, everything from China to Samaria.
absolutely. And I think when there's that much of a sort of universal history with a thing, we have to explore the thing and not just dismiss it out of hand.
Awesome. Well, cool. We're gonna post the links in the description below, and thanks for coming. We gotta have you back out.